Now, in order to populate this area here with the correct data, so the number of correctly answered questions and the number of total questions, we have to go to the results screen.dart file. And there in the build method, we have this text widget where we want to output the number of total questions and the number of correctly answered questions. How do we now plug in the correct values here? Now for this, we can add some final variables to the build method. Final because I don't plan on reassigning them inside of the build method. But I'm adding some variables here to dynamically derive these x and y values. And whilst we could do this here in place, inject it into this string, it would quickly lead to quite unreadable or at least hard to read code. And I'm doing this up here at the beginning of the build method to keep my overall code readable. So here I want to derive the number of total questions, which could be stored in a variable called num total questions, which I'll temporarily set to a dummy value of 0. This will change soon though. And then I want to have my number of correct questions, which I initially also set to 0. But of course now 0 should be replaced with the actual correct numbers. Now for num total questions, that's simple. We are importing our questions here. So in the end, this questions list here, defined in the questions.dart file. And therefore, we can simply set num total questions equal to questions.length, because that is our total amount of questions. Now, to find out which questions were answered correctly, we have to use our summary data here. Because in that summary data, we do store all the chosen answers and the correct answers. And if we compare these two values, we can find out whether the correct answer was chosen. So therefore here, in the build method, I want to get my summary data, and for that I'll add a new variable called summary data, which stores the result of calling getSummaryData. And I'm doing this here because I'm also using the result of calling this function down there. And to make sure that we don't unnecessarily call the same function twice within the same build method, I will call it once here, store the value in a variable, and then reuse that value by simply using that variable, which is one of the advantages of using variables. So with that, I'm using that summary data down there, but I can now also use it here to derive the number of correctly answered questions. To do that, we can use this summary data, which is a list of maps, where every map looks like this, to find out for how many map objects user answer is equal to correct answer. For this on summary data, so on this list of maps, we can call the built-in where method, which, just like map or add, is a method provided by Dart. Now, the where method allows you to filter the list on which you're calling it. But just like map, it does not change the original list, but it instead returns a new list. Or to be precise, it also returns such an iterable thing, which is almost like a list. So where can be used to filter this original list and create a new filtered list based on that original list. And to where you have to pass a function, just as you passed a function to map, which will be executed for every item in that list. And just as with map, you will then receive that item as an argument in that function which you pass to where. So here I get my data point, my map. And then inside of this function, unlike map, you don't return some transformed value, because that's not what where is used for, but instead you return true if that data point should be kept in that new filtered list that is returned by where, or false if it should be dropped. And of course, the trick is to not hard code true or false here, otherwise all values will be kept or all values will be dropped, but instead to dynamically derive whether it should be true or false. And for that, we can define a condition here, just as we did it before in this section when we learned about if statements. Here, I want to dive into my data point, so into my map here, and compare the value for the key user answer to the value for the key correct answer. So therefore here I access user answer with that syntax you learned about, accessing map values by keys like this. And I compare this with the double equal sign operator, because one equal sign would try to assign a new value, which is not what I want to do here. I want to compare this value with two equal signs. I want to check for equality, and I'll compare it to data and then the correct answer. So to this value stored under this key here. And if these two values are equal, we know that the user chose the correct answer. Hence, this will yield true, and this data point here will be kept in that new list that is generated by where. If the answers differ, then this here will yield false, and that data point will be dropped in this new list. And with that, we generate a new list. But of course, here I want to have a number of correctly answered questions, not a list of correctly answered questions. And therefore here at the end, we should access .length, which exists on these iterable objects here as well. And this then gives us the amount of items that were kept in this filtered list. And with that, we now have all we need: the number of total questions and the number of correctly answered questions. We can now use this here to inject it into this string. So to build this string dynamically with that syntax you learned about earlier in the course, where you can add a $sign in a string. And then here we want to have the number of all questions, so the num total questions. And x should be replaced with $num correct questions. And now, since we create this string dynamically, it can't be a constant value anymore, hence const should be removed. And I'll also add a comma here at the end after this string, so that this can be broken across multiple lines, at least a little bit. Well, and with that, you now see that indeed I do have some concrete numbers here. And with that, we're outputting the right data, but of course, it's not looking that good. And I also want to make sure that this part here is actually set to a fixed height and is then scrollable inside of that box, which is not the case right now.